Welcome to Conversations with Clients, the podcast from Ethical Quest. I'm Vicky Townsley, I'm the Director of Ethical Quest, and in each episode we will explore real-world stories that are relatable, helpful and inspiring. These are honest conversations with the clients we partner with. They will share stories from their organisations about leaders and teams who are navigating uncertainty, facing hard truths, and striving to lead with courage, connection, and compassion. At Ethical Quest, we believe lasting change starts from within. So whether you're here to stretch your thinking, build self-awareness, or simply reconnect with what matters, you're in the right place. Enjoy the conversation, everyone. Let's begin. What kind of leadership inspires people not just to follow, but to speak, explore, and grow, especially when things are uncertain? So I'm thrilled now to be joined by three incredible guests whose experience spans research, executive leadership, and organisational transformation. So I'd like to start with Gareth Hulley-Carter, who is the Group Chief People Officer at Lloyd's Register. Since joining Lloyd's Register in 2023, Gareth has been shaping the global people strategy across 72 countries. Now, I'd love to hear from you a little bit more about your path to leadership.
Thanks very much, Vicky. It's great to be here today. But yes, it is always surprising when I hear other people talk about 72 countries as well. I think about just the complexity, but also just the excitement that comes with being in so many countries and all of the different cultural contexts that we face on a day-to-day basis. I think I'm going to hone in on my most recent move to the role of Chief People Officer, and I call this era the unscripted path to leadership. And I think that's because I'd always believed that I'd one day step into the Chief People Officer role, but it came sooner than I expected. And with it, a mix of excitement, a little bit of uncertainty, but a deep sense of responsibility. Now, I often say this to others, you don't need to tick every single box before you put yourself forward for a promotion or a different role, but I really felt like I hadn't ticked every box and I wasn't sure I was ready. But I think I've come to realize that leadership often begins in those moments of uncertainty when you choose to back yourself anyway. And I quite often talk about strategic bets, and I think taking a strategic bet on yourself and on others, for me, is at the heart of leadership. Now, it's not about having all of the answers. And it's really important, I think, to recognize self-doubt, step outside of your comfort zone, but more importantly, be willing to grow into these contexts. But I think what guides me most and what's guided me actually all the way through my leadership career is this idea of confident humility. So it's the ability to lead with conviction while staying open, curious, and I think probably more importantly, really aware of what you don't yet know. And it's about trusting those around you. And I have a great team that support me at Lloyd Register. Trusting those around you to help really shape the path forward and creating space for their voices to really matter. So when I think about leadership and my journey, if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: don't wait for perfect timing. Show up, lean in, and lead with courage and humility.
Thank you so much, Gareth. This is such a common dilemma. And I know, John, you talk about this whole imposter syndrome thing. One of the reasons people don't speak up is the self-doubt. We doubt ourselves. And so I love that you brought that in straight away, Gareth, because in this climate of uncertainty, all of us are put in these situations where we don't have all the answers, and that can be really scary. And John, a lovely segue to you and your research. So John is someone I've had the privilege of collaborating with since 2020. Working with him and Megan Rates through their research, they've changed the way that we think about voice, power, and truth in organisational life. So I know you'd prefer to introduce yourself in your own words, John. Thank you so much again for coming today to share with us.
As Gareth was talking about his leadership journey, I promptly was abandoning my intro script, which is about me being an author, a researcher, a father. And I began to think about the pivotal moments in my own experience of my own authority, my own power. One of my absolute pivots was in 2004. 2 years before that, I'd walked out of being a business school leadership tutor. I'd just lost my mojo. I'd lost complete faith in what I was doing. I had the sense that I was encouraging people to turn themselves into things, and everybody just had to climb higher, faster, whatever. And something inside me was dying. And then in 2004, I was looking after the kids at the time, and the prime researcher into something called living leadership, an amazing guy called George Binney, said, "Oh, are you free to read through the text of this piece of research?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, why not?" And it was the best piece of research I had ever come across about leadership. It followed longitudinally people choosing whether or not to take the sort of step that Gareth was taking in terms of, do you want to join the executive team? Do you want to join the board? What is going to be the impact of that choice on your relationship with your significant others in your life? This was this research where you actually saw complicated human beings making decisions about themselves in the round, not just to move up the 9-box grid of, are you going to do better? And that inspired. I have shifted over the years to researching and writing by myself to always collaborating with somebody. And that has been the most joyous move in my life. Suddenly I moved from this idea that I had to know everything and I had to be the one who knew. And there is nothing like working with a really good colleague and this sense of you're just always playing and building, and they will bring insights and perspectives which you didn't know. And when I let go of my conditioned defensiveness, my sense of, I should know that, and was able to say things like, oh, blimey, I had no idea about that. And particularly, when thinking back to your 72 countries, people are bringing life experiences which you just do not know. And then I began to draw very explicitly on the experience of being a dad bringing up young children in an environment where mostly it was mums and women. And this suddenly I was the fish out of water. And it was this experience of being a minority. And it's like, oh, wow. And the imposter syndrome is quite a tricky one because it coexists with the confidence. And one of the most difficult messages that comes from Megan and my material into speaking up and speaking out is that by and large, the more senior you are, the more you think you are in touch with what's going down with the kids, the more in touch you think you are with what people below you are thinking and saying. And one of our most difficult messages, and normally these conversations last about 30 seconds before you're kicked out of the room, you know much less than you think you do about what's going on, which is a very anxiety-provoking thing to say to somebody, and also an attack on people's egos. But it's, how do you genuinely sustain a sense of humility? And I think I'm as prone as anybody. As you get more senior, older, and more expert, arrogance, your sense of, I've got this. And it's how you keep doubt alive and how you keep curiosity about the lives of others, which often will be seeing things that don't sit with you very easily. To me, that's my leadership journey.
And I love how you say it, John. You always say it with a lovely smile on your face in such a way people can hear it. But I love what you said about the importance of having a collaboration partner and not working on your own, which is one of the things I truly value about you, Elizabeth, because you are an amazing collaboration partner. Elizabeth's the Global People Development Director at Lloyd's Register, and we've worked together very closely across multiple leadership programs. So I'm going to ask you now to say a few words to bring you into the conversation, and thanks again for being here today.
Vicky, it's my absolute pleasure, and such interesting stories. And I think that word curiosity is so important in keeping mindsets open and something that I firmly believe in. I've been in this field now for around 25 years, looking at the full talent and performance cycle from early career all the way through to senior leadership and executive development. But it's not where I started my career. I was a lawyer first, and then I went in-house, and it was only through that I actually realised I wasn't a great lawyer. I actually really liked why deals were being done. What was the intent and mindset of a business? And from that, I started to dip my toe in people development and the people world, and was very lucky to have an opportunity in Thomson Reuters to build my career in HR, starting off with leading early career for nearly 4 years. And I've just been very blessed. For me, it's all about what value can I bring? What else do we need to work on? What is the problem that the business needs support on in terms of solving? And through that curiosity, the opportunities have followed. So I've been very lucky to work across multiple sectors, from retail to financial services to professional services. I've worked in manufacturing and technology, and now here at Lloyd's Register. And I've loved the breadth and the challenge that those different industries have brought me, because you think you know a solution or you think you know the latest thinking, but that business context is so important. So that's my journey.
So as you're listening, everyone, we've got some excellent breadth of experience here, but also some themes. So one theme you've heard everyone share so far is about the transitions they've made and their choices in their career. And often in leadership transitions, the theory is so easy. Be curious, be open. But in transition, we're all thrown out of our comfort zones, which brings in elements of fear. And when anyone is insecure, anxious, our natural inclination is to protect and control. So whilst this is very easy in theory, one of the things we've noticed in working with multiple organizations in practice, as an individual, there's something there about how do I manage that tension and tap into myself to unlock these qualities: humility, courage, openness, all the great things you've heard. But then the other point, and you touched on this, Elizabeth, is we're working in a world at the moment that is highly volatile and unpredictable. And you've got this environmental and system impact as well. So it's not just about individually, how do I manage how I show up? And speaking truth, which we're going to move into this first theme now of truth and courage. And having the courage to speak up is easy when you're telling people what they want to hear. When you're working in an environment and a context which is uncertain, it's not so easy. In that frame, let's move into theme number one. And we're going to start by inviting John to speak up, because that's his area of research. So John, would you like to get us started with some thoughts from your research around this?
Well, I'm a big fan of starting with the first person. I did actually read through your briefing note, which said, have you got a story about speaking truth in a courageous fashion? So the one I came to in the middle of last night was conversations I had with my psychoanalyst. So I started seeing a Jungian psychoanalyst in 1998, and I saw her on and off for about 20 years after that. I was a very cognitively bright person. I was a high flyer. Miserable, but a high flyer. And it was in the conversations with her where I began to admit my ordinariness, that broadly I could do with a bit of love, that what was hampering me, what was getting in the way of me living, were things that every human being goes through to some degree or another. And there was a genuine encounter with my modesty, which I hadn't had before, and also with the experience of the power of the unspoken, of the unconscious. And to realize, I usually understand why I'm doing something about 18 months after I've started. And it is this idea to begin to trust and pay attention to what story I'm telling myself. And sometimes that we're very good at presenting a very credible story. I mean, we've each given in our introductions as to where we've come from, very polished, polite versions of ourselves. What we haven't said is the times we've woken up sweaty, absolutely, completely confused and filled with self-doubt and loathing, or just filled with sense of, I am all but God in this world. Those aren't very polite ones, and we hide them away. Again, a lot of the corporate life has this very sanitized view of truth. And part of the living leadership work, we came across this guy who coined the phrase, isn't it interesting that Freud never mentioned shareholder value? And yet corporations bang on about it as, this is what's going to motivate people. And he said, funny how what really matters to human beings, sex, love, envy, rage, and we call it pink and fluffy. Methinks there's a bit of disguise going on there. And there is this refusal to encounter the rawness of human experience. And the truth and the courage is to accept that we show up as deeply flawed and brilliant human beings. who need each other. It's when we retreat into the fantasy of sovereign individuality that we'll never become as much as we could be. I went to do a piece of research into a hospice, and we were working with the teams. These are people who are working with people who are close to death. And it's very emotionally charged work. Those of us who don't work in a health sector or something like that, our work isn't a matter of life and death. It is actually at some level not that important. But there is something very, very important about working in a hospice. And so this team would always check in at the start of every shift that they were about to go on to check who had how much emotional resilience. Now, if you've had an argument with your mother-in-law, if the kids are playing up, are you just feeling knackered? Do you accidentally go out and get a bit pissed last night? It's this whole thing of who's strong here today. And that was absolutely essential because they knew where the weak link in the team was. And of course, so much of the time in our working lives, we pretend that we're going to be strong when we're not. And that just as a last bit before I'll shut up, the other thing, I just love the work of Kagan and Leahy and a German guy, I can't remember his name off the top of my head. And they talk about the theatre of business. And they talk about the extent that everybody at work is doing an unpaid second job, which is to pretend to do the work in the approved fashion while actually getting it done in the way that works. Most of us aren't very good actors, and it takes up a huge amount of our discretionary energy. Think what would happen in our workplaces if we could let people free from having to pretend to be either something they're not or to be working in a way that they know doesn't work.
Yeah, we've talked about that a lot, John, you and I, over the years, this corporate theatre. I love that phrase. And the concept of masking, because it's a human tendency that we all, in any environment, we go and we read the room and then we present ourselves in a way that we conform to the norm. But that doesn't necessarily reflect who we really are and how we really feel. And I also love what you said about our humanity unites us. We're all human beings. We all go through good days and bad days. Wouldn't it be a great world if we connected and had that connection in such a way that we can be ourselves? So, Elizabeth, Gareth, who would like to jump in?
I think there's a couple of things that kind of jump out for me. I think the first is, it's true when you hear the saying, there is more that connects us as humans than differentiates us. And I think we often forget that. The two questions I have is, individuals perhaps are less willing to show up as their real selves in those environments for fear of being judged? Or is it that actually we recognize that we might make other people feel uncomfortable in a professional setting and nobody wants to make other people feel uncomfortable in those contexts? But what's your views on that?
You've actually named the top two with the pieces of research about what stops people speaking up at work. The first one is you don't want to be thought of as an idiot by others. And your second one, which is, and you don't want to shame others. Particularly, you don't want to shame powerful others or senior others, which is part of what keeps senior people living in their echo chamber of ignorance. And it's the idea of that's perfectly normal. That's what people in groups do. And it's that realization of simply saying, oh, we're not going to judge you here, which is like, of course you are. You've already judged me on whether I'm judging you or not. And it is that, how do you play with those conceits? This is one of my favorite papers I love to reference because it's so academic, but it's so practical. It's called A Paradoxical Conception of Group Dynamics. It's got a very simple message, which is we get invited to join a group for our difference. You want so-and-so to come onto the exec team because they're different. But to stay in the group, you have to give up your difference. My frustration with when I look at board evaluation reviews and all this sort of stuff is their ignorance of basic group psychodynamics. And they're insistent on understanding organizational behavior purely through a rationalist procedural model. Yes, you need to have that rationalist procedural model. But the way that things like fear of being judged get disappeared, I get very frustrated.
It's truly fascinating. And I think you're absolutely right, John. Making sure you've got the right voices in the room is so important. But it is rare because speaking up, especially to senior executives, that is really brave. And it definitely takes a brave employee to step up and go, are we sure about this? Are we sure this is going to create the impact that we want? And I think your research is spot on as to the reasons why. I think there's also a personal element there that people have around what impact is speaking up have on me? Am I going to lose my job for speaking out and putting my head above the parapet? And I think depending on the culture of the organization, that fear can be very real. Or do I just sit tight? And often there's the human factors that play into that thinking as well. Well, I've got a mortgage to pay. I've got a family that depends on me. I've got my own personal situation. So do I want to have that risk of speaking out and actually stating something that might not be a popular thought, because that might impact me or my progress? So I do think there's a personal element there as well, that people often then choose not to speak up to senior leaders.
Queued up nicely, one of the particular frameworks that Megan and I have developed and use a lot of, which purely evolved from the data and had nothing to do with what the publisher said was going to be a useful thing. It spells the word truth when it comes to speaking truth. So the T is to do with trust. Do you trust your own opinion? And what we found by and large is that people trust their own opinion more than others. And so there again, part of this is to notice, particularly if you're in a senior position, is what can I do to amplify the sense of self-belief in others? And often for senior people, how do I dial down the sense of my own rightness? And that's a tricky one. So the R of truth is your risk one. What are going to be the consequences of me speaking up or hearing something I don't want to hear? And often we shoot up the ladder of inference and we're into, I'm going to be living on the streets within a week if I say this. I've often thought that when people say we need courageous conversations, I'm thinking the fact that you need courageous conversations tells you that something really fundamental is wrong. I remember writing a paper called If Whistleblowing's the Answer, Ask a Better Question, because it's indicating that you're putting all this responsibility for speaking up on the least well-resourced. Whereas actually the job is of the more senior, well-resourced people. What do I need to do to actually minimize the sense of risk in others? The U is understanding the politics. And it is this idea, all institutions are political. There's nothing quite as sweet as when you wander into an organization, they say, we're not a political organization. You just want to go, oh, bless. I wish you well on that. Without getting too much into the ancient Greeks, the point is that human societies are inherently political. It is how we negotiate difference. It's how we negotiate our different agendas. We all have slightly misaligned agendas in an organization because we all have different priorities where we are in our life cycle, in terms of where we are in the department. There is no pure unity. And this, again, from a business conceptual point of view, is quite interesting. It's saying the cult of alignment has got out of hand. Which is, the point is, you can't be aligned. The point is, how do you have community without alignment? And the goal is you need enough alignment. The way that we negotiate the fact that you can't have, in your case, 72 countries, how you implement different policies and all sorts of things, goodness knows how. And the point is, everywhere needs some wiggle room. And the point is that part of that will be political. And that's, okay, who has what type of influence and power?
This is a good point, John, around the politics. And I had a question I wanted to ask as you're talking about this is, as an internal business partner, I know a lot of the people listening will be in that role. One of the great challenges is, how do you raise awareness to some of the people in positions of power if they are unintentionally shutting others down, but they think that they're creating an environment that opens up?
It's understanding your titles. We're putting labels on each other the whole time about gender, age, ethnicity, and heaven knows what else. You have to own the titles that get put on you, whether you like them or not. And that then leads into the last of the truth thing, which is the how-to, which is right place, right time, right conversation. And if the more senior you are, it's the responsibility is, where will the other person feel comfortable? one of our first HBR articles brought up the problematic statement of saying my door is always open. And of course, that comes with a loaded message, which is it's said often with good intent, but it means I've got a door I can open or shut. You have to come and join me on my territory, which is going to give a sense of threat and risk to you. Whereas one of my favorite people we interviewed runs a city headhunter firm, and he was a lay Benedictine monk, and he followed the rule of St. Benedict. And the rule of St. Benedict says you always listen to the youngest monk in the monastery. And that played out is, where will your youngest employee feel most comfortable to speak up? One of my standard stories I tell on that one is there was a military commander in charge of a very significant part of the UK's defence. And he was always worried about what the experience was like for his cadets, 17-year-olds just joining. So he always used to get driven around the country by one of them, which I always think must have been quite terrifying. And he said, what gets said in the car stays in the car. And if you're in the car for a couple of hours, 17-year-olds will start chatting. And if they said something that alarmed him, he'd find out another way of getting that piece of data. But it is that thing of, where can I make people feel comfortable to speak to me? And where can I ensure that they don't get any blowback? And it's the way that we configure, for instance, town hall meetings. Usually it's very threatening. The people on the podium or the people leading the conversation are prepped to within an inch of their life. The ones in the audience are least prepped. And then you throw it open. Anybody got any questions? How terrifying is that?
One of the things I recognized, certainly more recently, is that often the stories that we tell ourselves sound or look far worse in our own mind. And I think the trick is to not sit with that for too long, because Vicky, I think you said we've all got a natural tendency to think about things in the negative. It's kind of a predisposition, isn't it? But actually seeking counsel from others in your support network, and I think as a leader, it's absolutely critical to build a support network of people around you from all different walks of life, different contexts, that you can draw upon their experiences, their views, their counsel on a particular situation that you might be facing. Because often when I'd done that, it's nowhere near as bad or as big as what I thought it was. And actually, they've really helped me in a very impartial way unpack that and work through some of those different scenarios. But I think, John, that works well when you've got the time to catch yourself in that moment and you to pick up the phone to somebody in your support network or even your team. What happens in those moments where you just don't have the time to do that because it's a high risk, high stake moment? You spot something, your inner critic's going, but you know you need to take action.
At the moment, with the current bit of research that Megan and I are into, time management has its role, but we're much more interested in attention management. And it is this whole idea of between, even in moments of high stress, the difference between reacting and responding. And it is that whole thing. It takes no more than a nanosecond. It takes a breath to catch yourself. But that is a discipline because we get caught up in the drama of it. Megan has been working with her mindfulness disciplines for ages. And her frustration is that, if you work with a team, they'll say, oh, it makes such a difference. But then they won't practice it. You can always choose how you respond. And it is quite an existential challenge because then you have to own, I behaved like a knee-jerk what's it. That was your choice. And it's this realization of quite how much choice you have in every moment. And it's so much easier to feel I had to do that rather than I am choosing to add to the swirl of busyness.
And it's all about humble leadership and self-awareness, which it's easy for us to talk about. I think as you go higher up an organization, it's quite hard because you have more people doing things for you. You're not as perhaps embedded in some of the real experiences. You might have that difference. You did the job that they did quite a long time ago. So you think you know it and the realities of today, but actually, do you really understand that? And I think it is just that humble leadership it's hard when you've got people around you. It's very easy for the ego to grow. It's constantly grounding yourself.
It doesn't happen by accident. I'm just thinking of one particular bank we spoke to, and it was just before the financial crash of 2008. And they were ensconced on, I think it was the 7th floor, and you couldn't get through it until you had the pass. They were the only people believing the financial reports about what was going on. All the people on the trading floor knew damn well that this was a powder keg just about to go bang. But an example of what this takes to really stay grounded is there's a lovely case of a chief executive of a London council a few years ago who every week would sometime during the week, spend 2 hours in the morning on reception. Now, when you're a citizen in a borough and you walk in through the front door, the title, the chief executive, means nothing to you. You usually arrive in quite a state of agitation because you want something fixed or done. And so if you want an experience of what's walking in through the door every day and how easy it is to field that person and put them in the right person in the institution, that's how you stay in touch. But it's every week, 2 hours on the front desk. And it's people say, oh, I'm too busy to do that. Well, the answer is you're too busy not to do that, because a lot of your busyness is coming about because you're so cut off from the reality of the experience. So we have a particular thing about pulse reports, which obviously have their role, but they again can be very insulting to a wider workforce because they remind people of the lack of relational interest. If you were really interested in me, you'd come and have a conversation. Every time you send me a survey to fill in, it just reminds me of the distance I have with you. And I've just reminded again of a lovely quote from the chief constable of one of the UK police officers who said, you can't have the big conversations until you have the small ones. And you start trying to fix things. And it's like, don't. Because you think you're being helpful, but you're not. Because you think that the way that you add value is by having a tangible outcome, whereas actually the outcome is relational connection. And this is where we get into the work on spaciousness. We've lost the art of valuing relational connection, interdependence, learning and creativity, because we're fixated with busyness.
I think you're right, John. And that's something that we place a huge value on organizationally. And that's encouraging senior leaders at all levels to get out into the business and spend time with our biggest population globally, which is our surveyor population. Often they're out on huge vessels, either in shipyards or at sea, and they have hugely demanding, challenging roles where some of the surveys that they do are, incredibly dangerous. And they do this to ensure the safety of those vessels and all of those individuals on those vessels. And it would be really easy for people like Elizabeth and I and those in group functions to sit in our head office in London or wherever and come up with the latest fashions from a people perspective. But unless we really know what those lived experiences are of those colleagues on the ground who these solutions touch or will touch on a day-to-day basis, how do we truly know that we're making a difference to them and improving their lives so much so that they thrive at work? Without that, you can't really, I don't think.
And I think something we've been working on with our top leadership, not just our executives, but our top leadership, we've been coining this phrase, drink more tea, and go out, talk to our business strategy, talk to the meaning of it. What does this mean for you? But go and drink more tea. Because I think, especially with COVID and the use of online meeting tools, we've become quite insular. And those smaller chats that you were talking about, John, as being so important, they happen a lot less. And yet that's where you get nuggets of information. But that also is, as a leader, where you can create and land something quite meaningful or navigate some of the thinking that an employee may or may not have about the direction that we're headed as an organization, a myth bust. But you've got to drink more tea in order to do that and invest that time. And it's something, as I say, that we've been really encouraging our top 100, top 120 to go and do, because it's vitally important to engage our colleagues around the world.
I want to jump in here and just pose one of the the issues you raise in your MIT Sloan article, John, creating that space to drink more tea can feel countercultural in a crisis. Because a lot of people are struggling with, let's say you have a geopolitical change announced somewhere in the world that impacts on supply chain. I mean, we have a good intention to drink more tea and go and connect with surveyors in your examples. And I think many practitioners we work with have the same intention. But when we're in a crisis, what happens is we go the opposite way and get into fix-it, busy mode. So that's the tension, isn't it? What are your thoughts on that?
Because there's a particular story, and I'm now going to send all sorts of diversionary flares off to ensure that it can't be tracked. So this is about let's call it a mining company somewhere, and they, as happens in those sorts of industries, there was a disaster and people died. And they had to make the decision about whether or not to stop searching for the bodies and just level the site, because no one could have survived. And the conversation within the board, everyone wanted to just leave it to the chair and the chief exec. You could see everybody saying, this is really too difficult. But most people said, look, the economic imperative took absolute control. This was a senior group making an absolutely major decision in the face of about as traumatic as you can get. And they said, we're going to take half an hour now. Some of you may want to meditate. Some of you may want to go for a walk. And then we'll reconvene. They did that. They came back. They made a collective decision, which they all owned, which was to continue finding the bodies. And that was, at one level, you're saying, are you telling me that a heavy industry, a mining company, these are not blushing flowers. This group of people seriously took half an hour in the face of everybody screaming at them saying, give us a decision, give us a decision. They said, no, we're going to take half an hour. We're going to get in the right state of mind to make a good decision. And I would just love to take what on earth they were drinking, those people, and just pass it around the world.
How did they get there, John? What do you think helped them to see the value in doing that?
They had been working alongside a mindfulness coach. One of the senior execs took that really seriously and insisted, and they'd had experience of taking mindfulness seriously in their own group meetings. So they would do things like do a pause. So whenever I do my research with Megan now, we will start off with 3 to 4 minutes. It's basically a structured meditation, but we don't call it that. And she presents it very lightly, but it's this whole idea of, isn't it mad that we crash from meeting to meeting to meeting and don't say, right, how do I land here?
Elizabeth, you and I were talking about this on our walk. We were talking about neuroscience and the fact that your brain cannot, from a stressed state, go into the neocortex where you access the higher intelligences. So that just being aware of that and how the brain works and how to create the space to access those intelligences to be able to do that critical thinking and reflection is in itself a key part of the learning and preparation.
100%. And we also know that our best creative thinking, you don't have your best ideas at work after 8 hours of meetings. You have your best ideas when you're taking the dog for a walk, in the shower. That's where you have that ping scenario. So, John, I love that example of actually we're just going to take time out, go and have a breather, go into nature, whatever it is, and come back. I think I've been most impressed with Gareth at times, and this is not me trying to impress my boss here, when I've got onto a meeting and he said, oh, God, got decision fatigue, Elizabeth. So you're not wanting a decision from me, are you? Because I'm done. I'm up there with this. And I can't make a decision right now. And that shows such self-awareness. I think as senior executives, there is this expectation that, one, they will know all the answers, which, John, you referred to. It's that put the cape on, go and solve the problem, and that they should have the answer in the moment. And actually, with some of the crisis situations that many leaders have had to deal with, and when we talk VUCA World, COVID was that great example where every single sector, every single business, every single family were having to make very difficult decisions, taking time to just reflect and breathe and think about it before you jump in. Because then once you've got the thinking and you make the decision, then you can move at pace. But decision making at significant pace, that's where often decisions are perhaps taken that aren't the right ones, or that end up changing down the line because actually, we missed something. So that need for space to get your brain in gear, ready, and to be thinking about the right things, you've got to give yourself that space.
I was just reminded of Martin Luther, the 16th century theologian, had this statement of he always prayed for at least an hour a day, except when he had a really, really busy day. Then he prayed for 3.
And this is thinking about the third theme because it links, is the importance of self-awareness. Elizabeth just gave an example about you were aware of the fact that you've been making back-to-back meeting, decision fatigue. That's when we talk about leading from the inside out, that's about emotional intelligence and being aware of where do I need to take space. And also being aware of, John, you referenced this earlier, is my truth the truth? So Gareth, how do you help to stay in that presence? What do you think really helps to make a difference when it comes to being self-aware and emotionally intelligent and how we show up in our conversations?
In an ideal world, if you could segment your day and construct your diary in such a way, how would you do that to ensure that you show up as your best self? And Elizabeth and I know that for me, between 7 and 11 a.m. is where if I need to make a very difficult decision or we need to make a call on an investment request, then the best time to do that is between 7 and 11 for me. So thinking, knowing that about yourself is incredibly important. And I think that only really comes through feedback that you get from others. And so regularly seeking views from those around you, but also doing the work on yourself and recognizing in those moments, if you've got a narrow window of tolerance at 3:00 in the afternoon and you can feel that actually you're jumping from one thing to the next and maybe your responses aren't quite delivered in a way that you would want them to, then actually taking that moment to pause, check in with yourself, seek to understand what's going on in that moment. Is it your environment? Is it just that you're tired at that moment in time? What's your week look like? Enables you then to essentially mitigate some of the issues that can come from operating on autopilot and not taking good care of yourself.
And it's really interesting you say that, Gareth, because so many leaders that I've worked with, their diaries control them. And it's, I can't have space because I'm back to back all day. And they are totally controlled by the rhythm and the meeting cadence of the organization. And often, especially with more junior leaders, when I work with them and it's, well, no, actually, you're in control. You are allowed to block time. You are allowed to give yourself space. And you are allowed to push back and say, no, that doesn't work for me. And giving them that autonomy makes a big difference. It makes a big difference for the leader, but it's so important, especially as you then go up, because the decisions are perhaps more critical and you need to be able to do that, to give your brain space to breathe and take on the information, absorb it, and then make an assessment that makes the most sense. But I think so many people are governed by the corporate diary and rather than self-managing. If you can get into that cadence of self-management, it can make a big difference for leaders.
In an ideal world, we'd equip individuals and leaders, regardless of whether you're leading others, leading self or lead business, with the tools, the resources, the vocabulary, the skills and knowledge to be able to know this about themselves. I mean, we all know that with our iPhone, for example, we have to do a software upgrade. And if we don't do a software upgrade, then the security features and the phone malfunctions. And whilst I'm not suggesting that we treat ourselves as a machine, I mean, technically we are. So I'm always curious as to why we don't necessarily look after ourselves in the same way that we brush our teeth every morning and every night, and we take our car for a service and we might take it to be washed. But many of us don't think of ourselves in that way until you hit crisis point. So often I find you only start to hold up the mirror when you're at the point or have burnt out. But actually, it is so important. And I think leaders recognize this now to focus on that kind of preventative well-being, dare I say, but in different contexts. The steps that you can take beforehand so that you can avoid a situation whereby you are burnt out, you've got back-to-back meetings. And sometimes you can't control that, by the way. That is just the environment that you work in. But what are the things that you can control, to Elizabeth's point, that will make your life a little bit easier and those around you?
And we're starting to see organisations talking in that language, which is really good to see. And I very much speak around the language of energy, because energy drives so much. It drives the quality of your thinking, it drives the quality of your output, and managing your energy is important. But I 100% agree, Gareth. We don't spend enough time doing that audit almost of what is and what isn't working now. And you get promoted and you're at the next level and you're straight in there, and you don't actually do an audit as to what are the things that I now need to shift in order to take that next level of responsibility or workload. What are the things that might hold me back? We don't spend enough time doing that when we go into roles. It's whoopee, let's go.
Busy.
Busy. We're all busy, crazy busy.
I'm just reminded, though, one of the guys we researched, when he gave the phrase, maybe Sisyphus was a happy man. And it's this idea that we love being busy, just having a task to do, because it allows us to avoid paying attention to other things. It's this narrative mind. And it's paying attention to what's the story I'm telling myself about who I am in the world. And I'm also thinking about, I'm now a man in his 60s, and I have a very different energy level. And it's been shifting constantly since I've been in my 20s. And it's also taking emotional load seriously. And again, I think the thing I can often not recognize is that being in a senior position, making significant calls, is emotionally demanding. We always like to say, oh, it's strictly business. I know of very, very few leaders who like laying people off. Most people don't like it when they have to make a tough decision. We're pulling out of that market, we're going into that market. I have just blown up a whole team's career, things they've invested in for the last 10 years. That hurts a decent human being, and most people are decent human beings. And it's this idea of, I can compartmentalize it. I don't think that's true. I don't think any human being can compartmentalize.
John, it's leading with humanity. And I think it's absolutely on point for what we do from a people perspective, but leaders across the world in every context. It's knowing that every policy, for us, every restructure, essentially every decision affects real people with real lives. And it is so important to not lose touch with that, because to lose touch of that, you're operating from a completely blind point of view, really, because you've got absolutely no idea or potentially no concern about how these decisions might impact others. And some of these decisions, they have to be made. They have to be made for the greater good of the organization, but doing so with compassion, with empathy, holding the person at the center of what you're doing is so critically important.
We could talk about this for another hour, and it's been such a rich conversation. Thank you, all of you. And so I wanted to start to think about linking all of this together. The theme for this podcast is about inspiring leadership, and how can we create a space for the right kind of conversations that enable people to tell the truth and have the courage to tell the truth, enable us to be emotionally intelligent, and also help us to move into call it the sacred space. How can we create the space to have the right conversation? So I'd love to hear from each of you. What would be your key takeaways from the discussions we've had today?
If I just want anything, it's the self-awareness. And that is a never-ending journey. I started with a psychoanalytic reference, but my psychoanalyst had this very nice image which has served me very well. which is, if you remember the old 33 1/3 long playing records, vinyl records, and you put the needle on the outside and you go round and round and round the circle towards the center. And it feels like you're covering the same ground, but you're somehow getting closer to the center. And to me, that's what a lot of that self-awareness is about. And things like the psychometrics and whatever are useful staging posts. But the point is that they are aids to deepen your self-awareness. They are not the answer. And to me, the other thing that I've really emphasize more than anything on self-awareness is it's awareness in relationship with others. I'm a big fan of the relational psychology school over the more traditional one, that it's growth in connection. Your awareness grows through your relationships with others. And it's when we see that self-awareness is something I do on my own that it runs into a brick wall. It's only when we realize we grow together or we don't grow at all.
I think you said something that resonated, John, around reacting versus responding. And I think about my relationship with my children, and often I'm reacting versus responding, but I know I also do that at work. And I think we all do. Emails keep coming in and you're just firing things off. And even just having that, am I reacting to this or am I responding? Just having that slight pause is something that I'm going to take away, because that can seriously shift what you do in that moment. And there's an element of the relationship that you're trying to build on the other side of this, whether it's an email, whether it's what you say, whether it's in a meeting. That's a lovely golden nugget to take away.
I agree, Elizabeth. It's definitely the shadows that we cast as leaders, isn't it? I think for me, it's knowing that I'm anchoring onto the fact that pretty much every decision that we make affects real people. It's really important to stay grounded in your values, even under pressure. But there are occasions where you might feel that you need to compromise on your values under pressure. So holding on to those under pressure is really important. We're living in a world where the speed in which things happen, the speed in which decisions need to be made can be quite confusing for those around us if you're not taking people with you on the journey. Moving at pace with intention, but ensuring that those around you, whether that be your team or stakeholders, are informed. Although I do remember what you said, John, that actually it's rare that you can get alignment. It's probably somebody has to compromise, I guess, at some point. But more importantly, ready for what's ahead, whatever that challenge is. For me personally, it's about remembering to continue to hold myself accountable to the privilege of leadership. And that's not to be right as a leader, but it's to do right for those around me and for the organisation that I represent.
One thing just popped into my head as you spoke, that is change at the speed of the human heart.
It's a great phrase.
Thanks so much for listening to another episode of Conversations with Clients. At Ethical Quest, we know that authentic leadership is an inside-out journey. This journey is rooted deeply in emotional intelligence. It is full of courageous reflection, and we believe this kind of leadership is what really inspires meaningful human connection, much needed in today's world. When we share our stories, we build bridges, we support each other, and we drive change that really lasts. So if this conversation has sparked something in you, please feel free to share it with somebody who may benefit from hearing it. And if you're curious about how we partner with you to create real sustainable change, feel free to visit us at our website, www.ethicalquest.co.uk. Until next time, keep listening to and leading from the inside out. Thank you so much.